I survived a car crash that should have killed me. My brakes failed on a steep hill in Atlanta, sending my truck smashing into a solid concrete barrier. When I woke up in the hospital with a shattered leg, fractured ribs, and a badly bruised spine, I truly thought the worst of my nightmare was over. I thought my daughter Rachel taking me into her beautiful suburban home was a blessing. I thought I was finally safe. But I was dead wrong. Exactly 1 week after I moved in, my 7-year-old granddaughter Lily crept up to my wheelchair. She grabbed my sleeve, her little hands shaking violently. She looked over her shoulder, absolutely terrified, and whispered, "Grandpa, you should not stay here." Then she pulled me toward a dark hallway in the basement. And what I saw behind a locked door made me wish I had died in that car crash. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The massive house my daughter Rachel and her husband Greg owned in the wealthy suburbs of Alpharetta was dead silent. They called it a mansion. It had towering vaulted ceilings, pristine marble floors, and way too many empty rooms. To outsiders, it looked like a palace. To me, it felt much more like a museum, cold and utterly devoid of life. I was sitting in my wheelchair by the large bay window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn. My right leg was encased in a heavy plaster cast, propped up awkwardly on the elevated leg rest of the chair. Every time my heart beat, a dull, relentless, throbbing pain echoed deep inside the shattered bones of my leg. I am 71 years old. My name is Rick. For 40 years of my life, I worked as a structural engineer. I designed suspension bridges, highway overpasses, and massive structures of steel and concrete meant to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I spent my life calculating load-bearing weights and stress points, ensuring that things would not collapse under heavy pressure. My hands, heavily calloused and scarred from decades on dusty construction sites, used to bend iron and grip heavy tools with ease. I was a man who built things that lasted. But now, sitting in this freezing, overly air-conditioned room, I felt completely useless. I was trapped inside a broken, failing body, unable to even walk to the kitchen to get a simple glass of water without someone assisting me. The silence of the sprawling house was suffocating. Rachel and Greg were out running errands, or so they had casually mentioned over breakfast. They had supposedly hired a private medical nurse who was scheduled to arrive later that afternoon. For the moment, I was entirely alone, or at least I thought I was alone. Suddenly, I heard the soft, hesitant padding of small feet on the hardwood floor behind me. I turned my head, slowly wincing, as my bruised ribs protested the sudden movement. It was Lily, my granddaughter. She was 7 years old, a sweet girl with blonde hair, and usually a bright smile that could light up any room. But today, there was no smile on her face. She crept into the living room, as if she were trying to avoid waking a sleeping monster. She did not skip. She did not hum a happy tune. She moved with a strange, heavy caution that no child her age should ever possess. She stopped right next to my wheelchair. I looked down at her, forcing a warm, reassuring smile despite the sharp ache radiating through my chest. "Hello there, sweetie," I said, keeping my voice low and gentle so I would not startle her. "Are you playing a game of hide-and-seek today?" She did not answer my question. Instead, she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my faded flannel shirt. Her little fingers were clutching the worn fabric so tightly that her tiny knuckles turned completely white. She leaned in close to my arm, her breath warm and rapid. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly it broke my heart into pieces. "You should not stay here." I froze completely. The forced smile faded from my face in an instant. I looked deeply into her wide, terrified blue eyes. Children have a very specific look when they are afraid of the dark, or when they think there is a monster hiding under their bed. I raised my own daughter, so I knew that look well. But this was not a childhood fear. This was pure, unadulterated terror. It was the look of someone who had seen something incredibly real and incredibly dangerous. "Lily, what are you talking about?" I asked softly, shifting my weight in the chair. "Is everything okay? Did Mommy or Daddy scold you for something?" She shook her head rapidly, her eyes darting nervously toward the grand staircase in the foyer, as if she expected someone to come marching down at any second. No, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the air conditioning. You have to go. You have to leave today. Look, she tugged on my sleeve, again pulling me gently, but firmly, toward the hallway that led to the private residential elevator. Because of my wheelchair, they had told me I was strictly restricted to the main floor. The elevator went down to the expansive basement, a place Greg used for his home office and extra storage. I had never been down there since I arrived. Show me, I said, my voice dropping to a serious whisper. I gripped the metal rims of my wheelchair. The cold steel felt familiar beneath my calloused palms, but my arms were terribly weak from weeks of lying in a hospital bed. With every single push of the wheels, a sharp stabbing pain shot up my right shoulder, radiating down into my fractured ribs. The thick rubber tires squeaked faintly against the pristine marble floors, a sound that seemed absolutely deafening in the unnatural quiet of the giant house. I pushed through the pain, following the little girl. Lily walked right beside me, keeping her small hand firmly on my arm. We reached the elevator doors. She reached up on her tiptoes and pressed the glowing down button. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. I rolled myself inside the wood-paneled cab and she followed, hitting the button for the basement level. The descent was agonizingly slow. My heart was pounding against my ribcage, heavy and fast, like a steel hammer striking a heavy anvil. I tried desperately to convince myself that this was just a child's overactive imagination. Maybe she had watched a scary movie on her tablet. Maybe she misunderstood a complicated adult conversation. But my gut, the deep instinct honed by decades of anticipating structural failures before they even happened, was screaming at me loudly. Something in this house was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The elevator doors finally opened to the basement. It was not a dark, unfinished cellar with exposed pipes. It was a sprawling, fully finished lower level, with plush gray carpets and bright recessed lighting. The air down here felt significantly cooler, almost sterile, like a hospital corridor. Lily stepped out first. She did not let go of my sleeve. She guided me down a long, narrow hallway lined with several closed doors. At the very end of the hall was a heavy, solid oak door. It was Greg's private office. Or at least, that is exactly what Rachel had told me on my first day here. She had explicitly said it was off limits because Greg had highly sensitive client financial files in there. But as we got closer, I saw that the heavy door was not fully shut. It was left ajar by just an inch or two, allowing a thin sliver of harsh white fluorescent light to spill out onto the dark carpet. Lily stopped about 10 feet away from the door. She let go of my sleeve and took a large step back, wrapping her arms around her own small torso, as if she were freezing cold. She pointed a violently trembling finger at the sliver of light shining through the crack. In there, she whispered, tears finally welling up in her eyes and spilling down her pale cheeks. I saw it this morning when Daddy left. Please, Grandpa. Look. I swallowed hard. My throat felt exactly like dry sandpaper. I gripped the wheels of my chair and pushed myself forward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the glowing crack in the door. The silence in the basement was so heavy, it felt like deep water pressing violently against my eardrums. I reached out with a shaking hand and placed my palm flat against the cool wood of the oak door. I took a deep, painful breath, bracing myself for whatever childish misunderstanding lay behind it. But as I pushed the door open, the reality of the situation hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The room was not an office. The truth waiting inside was so horrific, so incredibly calculated and cruel, that my blood ran ice cold, and the peaceful, loving family life I thought I knew shattered instantly into a million unfixable pieces. I pushed the heavy oak door the rest of the way open. It swung inward on freshly oiled hinges, making absolutely no sound. The air inside did not smell like printer ink or old books you would expect from a home office. Instead, it was the sterile, unforgiving stench of rubbing alcohol-bleached sheets and chemical antiseptics. My eyes adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting humming overhead. I blinked, trying to make sense of the room. As an engineer, my brain is hardwired to process spatial reality instantly. But right then, my logical brain completely stalled. There was no mahogany desk. There were no filing cabinets tucked into the corners. There was no glowing computer monitor displaying stock market trends. The center of the room was dominated by a single terrifying piece of machinery. It was a heavy-duty motorized medical bed. The thick frame was industrial steel painted a dull, clinical gray. But it was not the cold metal that made my stomach drop. It was what was attached to the rails. Thick, dark leather restraints, 4 of them, 2 at the head of the bed and 2 at the foot. They were bolted into the steel frame with heavy industrial rivets, the kind of reinforced hardware you use to tie down heavy cargo, not frail human beings. I rolled my wheelchair closer, my breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I reached out a trembling hand and brushed my fingertips against the leather strap meant for a right wrist. It was brand new, thick, and completely unyielding, fastened with heavy metal buckles. I spent my career studying tensile strength. I knew load-bearing capacities intimately. These restraints were not meant to keep an elderly patient from rolling out of bed. They were meticulously designed to hold down a fully grown man who was fighting back with every ounce of his strength. They were designed to keep someone completely trapped. A wave of profound nausea washed over my body. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breakfast down. Why would Rachel, the little girl I taught to ride a bicycle, have a psychiatric restraint bed hidden in the basement of her luxury home? I tore my eyes away from the bed and looked toward the far wall. A massive 6-foot-wide whiteboard was mounted against the drywall. It was covered in paperwork held up by dozens of small black magnets. I pushed the wheels of my chair forward, ignoring the burning pain shooting up my broken leg. I needed to see what was on that board. As I got within 3 feet of it, the breath left my lungs. The documents were not Greg and his commercial real estate contracts. They were mine. Every piece of paper on that board belonged to me. There were copies of my retirement account statements, my pension payouts, the deed to my house in Atlanta, and my investment portfolio summaries. Someone had gone through my private financial life with a fine-toothed comb. My total net worth, roughly $4.5 million, was circled multiple times in thick black ink at the very top of the board. But it was the writing in bright red marker beneath my bank statements that made the blood freeze in my veins. The handwriting was unmistakably Rachel, and her specific cursive style. I had seen her write birthday cards and grocery lists for 40 years. The red letters spelled out payment deadline October 15th. Right beneath that, in the same bright red marker, were the terrifying words, cognitive decline progressing. My mind spun out of control. Payment. Deadline cognitive decline. I was sharp as a tack. My memory was flawless. I had spent the week feeling slightly foggy, but I had attributed that to the painkillers and the concussion from my car crash. They were tracking a cognitive decline that did not exist. Or worse, a decline they were trying to artificially create. My eyes darted to a small stainless steel medical cart parked next to the head of the bed. On top of the cart sat a silver tray holding several orange prescription pill bottles. I wheeled myself over to the cart, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick one of the bottles up. I held it up to the fluorescent light. The patient name printed on the label read, Richard Dalton. My name. The prescribing doctor was someone I had never heard of in my life. I rotated the bottle to read the medication name. Haloperidol. 50 milligrams. I may be an old bridge engineer and not a doctor, but my late wife had been a registered nurse for 30 years. I knew enough about medications to know that haloperidol is a high-dose, severe antipsychotic drug. It is used to chemically subdue violent patients suffering from severe schizophrenia or advanced dementia. It is not a painkiller meant for a broken leg. It is a chemical straitjacket. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with horrifying clarity. The fogginess I felt every morning, the faint metallic taste in the orange juice Rachel handed me with breakfast every day, the sudden exhaustion that would hit me like a brick wall by noon. They were already drugging me. My own daughter and her husband were secretly poisoning me with antipsychotics to fake a cognitive decline, preparing to strap me to this horrific bed in their basement to steal the money I had worked 40 years to save. What would you do if you realized your own flesh and blood built a trap for you? Let me know in the comments below, because sitting in that wheelchair staring at my own chemical execution, I felt a kind of heartbreak that no physical injury could ever match. The heavy silence of the basement suddenly shattered as the floorboards creaked violently directly above my head. My son-in-law Greg was walking directly toward the wooden staircase, and I was sitting completely paralyzed right inside his secret prison. Time was up. The rhythmic thud of expensive leather dress shoes echoed through the ceiling directly above me. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound I recognized instantly. Greg. My son-in-law was home. Judging by the determined weight of his footsteps, he was walking straight toward the foyer staircase leading down to this exact basement. Cold panic pierced through my chest. I had maybe 2 minutes before he reached the bottom. If he found me sitting in this room staring at a psychiatric bed and a whiteboard detailing his plan to steal my life savings, I knew I would never make it out of this house alive. Lily let out a stifled gasp. Her small hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute dread. She knew what her father was capable of. I desperately had to get her out of here. I reached out and grabbed her trembling shoulder. "Run quickly upstairs to your room, sweetie," I whispered, keeping my voice steady. "Do not tell him you were down here. Just go." She did not hesitate. She turned and darted down the hallway, her socks sliding silently against the gray carpet. She slipped into the shadows near the back staircase just as the heavy wooden door at the top of the main basement stairs groaned open. I gripped the cold metal rims of my wheelchair. My palms were slick with sweat. I clamped my jaw shut, bracing myself for the immense physical toll this would take on my broken body. I threw my weight backward, pulling the wheels with every ounce of strength I had left. The chair rolled backward out of the terrifying room. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the oak door. I pulled it shut, praying the freshly oiled hinges would remain perfectly silent. It clicked into the doorframe with a soft thud. I had to cross 40 feet of open hallway, get into the elevator, and make it to my bedroom before Greg rounded the corner. I began to push. My triceps burned instantly, screaming in protest as they bore the dead weight of the heavy steel chair and my immobilized body. Each thrust of my arms sent a shockwave of pain tearing through my bruised spine and fractured ribs. But the worst pain came from my right leg. The thick plaster cast felt like an anchor made of solid lead. Because of the elevated leg rest, every time the wheels hit even the slightest uneven patch of carpet, the vibration shot straight into my shattered tibia. It felt like someone was repeatedly striking my shin bone with a hot iron hammer. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw popped. I could not afford to make a single sound. The heavy thud of Greg walking down the wooden stairs grew louder and more distinct. He was taking his time, probably checking his phone, unaware that his sinister plot was unraveling just a few yards away. I reached the elevator doors and slammed the heel of my good left foot against the call button. The wait felt like an absolute eternity. Seconds stretched into hours. Sweat began to pour down my forehead, stinging my eyes and blurring my vision. My heart was hammering against my ribcage so violently that I feared I might have a heart attack right there in the hallway. "Come on," I prayed silently, watching the digital floor indicator above the door. Finally, the metal doors slid open. I threw myself backward, yanking the wheels aggressively to spin the chair around. I reversed into the small cabin and frantically smashed the button for the main floor. The doors began to close just as I heard Greg reach the bottom landing. His leather shoes stepped off the wood and onto the carpet. If he turned his head left, he would see the doors sliding shut. I held my breath, pressing myself far back against the rear wall. The doors snapped shut. The cabin began to slowly ascend. I let out a shaky breath, wiping the stinging sweat from my eyes. But I was not safe yet. The metal elevator reached the main floor with a soft chime. I pushed the doors open before they could even fully retract. I was completely exhausted, my old lungs burning for oxygen, but pure adrenaline forced me forward. I wheeled out into the bright foyer. The plush Persian rugs in the front living room were an absolute nightmare for the rubber tires. I had to push twice as hard to maintain any forward momentum. I could hear the basement door opening again. Greg was slowly coming back up. I wheeled frantically down the long corridor toward the guest suite they had converted into my bedroom. My muscles were giving out. My hands were blistered and raw from the harsh friction of the metal rims. I reached my door, shoved it open, and rolled myself inside. I spun the heavy chair around to face the window, panting heavily. I desperately needed a solid alibi. I reached out blindly toward the small mahogany nightstand beside my bed and grabbed the first object my fingers brushed against. It was a thick hardcover novel Rachel had left there. I flipped it open randomly and dropped it onto my lap, resting my shaking hands on the open pages. I took one final massive gulp of air and forced my breathing to slow down into a steady, rhythmic pace. I commanded my facial muscles to completely relax, masking the sheer terror and physical agony coursing through every nerve of my body. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom. The brass doorknob turned slowly. The door swung open, revealing Greg standing in the threshold. He wore a tailored suit, his eyes dark and calculating. He stared at me in total silence for a long, agonizing moment. I slowly looked up from my book, blinked twice, and offered him the tired, confused smile of a completely helpless old man. Greg stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as they darted from my face to the heavy cast on my leg, and finally to the thick, hardcover book resting on my lap. I held my breath, burying the panic deep inside my chest. I made sure my hands trembled just enough to look like the frail, exhausted father they expected me to be. After what felt like hours, the hard lines of his jaw finally relaxed. He let out a short, dismissive breath, clearly convinced that I had been sitting there all afternoon, lost in a book I could barely comprehend. Before he could say a single word, a bright, cheerful voice echoed from the hallway behind him. It was Rachel. She pushed past her husband, carrying a stack of neatly folded towels. She wore a pristine white blouse and a perfectly practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Oh, good, you are awake," she chimed, stepping into my room with a breezy, effortless grace. "Greg told me you were resting. How is the pain today, Dad?" I carefully closed the book and set it on the nightstand, letting out a long, theatrical sigh. "The pain is manageable, sweetie," I lied, my voice wavering perfectly. "But my mind feels incredibly cloudy today. In fact, I got a little confused earlier. I was trying to find the linen closet to grab an extra blanket, and I ended up rolling down the hallway near the elevator. I pressed the wrong button and accidentally went down to the basement. I paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the room. Greg instantly stiffened. His shoulders locked and his dark eyes locked onto mine, like a predator sensing a threat. But Rachel did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not drop the towels. Her smile never faltered for a fraction of a second. She casually set the towels at the foot of my bed and tilted her head, looking at me with an expression of pure, condescending pity. "Oh, Dad, you should not be wandering around down there by yourself," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You could easily hurt yourself with that heavy cast. What were you doing in the basement?" I kept my expression blank, channeling my discipline from 4 decades of engineering negotiations. "Well, I noticed a door was left open at the end of the hall," I said, making my voice sound weak and uncertain. "I thought it was Greg's home office. But I saw a strange medical bed in there. It had these thick leather straps on the frame, and there was a large whiteboard on the wall with all my bank statements and retirement accounts pinned to it. I was just a little confused, Rachel. What exactly is that room for the psychological chess match officially began? I watched her face closely, waiting for a crack in her perfect facade. A stammer, a nervous glance at Greg, a sudden change in her breathing pattern. But there was absolutely nothing. Rachel walked over and gently patted my shoulder, her touch feeling like a block of solid ice against my skin. "Oh, that room," she laughed softly, a bright sound making my stomach churn. "We wanted it to be a surprise, but I guess you ruined it. That is your new physical therapy studio, Dad. The doctors said you are going to need intense rehabilitation once that cast comes off. The bed is specially designed for resistance training. Those straps are actually just heavy-duty tension bands to help you stretch your atrophied muscles safely without falling." She looked me dead in the eye, her gaze steady and warm. I stared back at her, internally reeling from the absolute perfection of her lie. She was smooth. She was terrifyingly convincing. If I had not seen the high-dose antipsychotic medication sitting on that cart, I might have actually believed her. "And what about the whiteboard with my financial documents?" I asked, forcing a small, confused chuckle. It looked like a bank vault down there. Greg stepped forward, his hands deep in his tailored trousers. His smooth voice perfectly matched his wife's performance. "That is just me trying to keep your life organized, Richard," he said calmly. "With your hospital bills and ongoing insurance claims, things are just getting complicated. We pinned your statements up there to build a clear budget strategy. We want your retirement fund completely protected while you heal. Your cognitive state has been a bit foggy since the accident, so we are handling the heavy lifting for you. There is absolutely nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about." The words echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. I looked at Rachel, my only child. I looked at the delicate features of her face, the face I had kissed goodnight 1,000 times. Suddenly, a vivid memory flashed behind my eyes. I was 45 years old, working an 80-hour week on a grueling bridge project in the dead of winter. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the freezing steel. I took extra shifts just so I could afford the designer prom dress she desperately wanted. I remembered the pure joy on her face when I brought it home. I gave her everything I had. I built a mountain of sacrifices so she could stand on top of it. Now she was lying to my face while plotting to destroy my mind and steal everything. But I could not let them see my true heartbreak. I had to play their sick game flawlessly. I let out a shaky breath, allowing immense relief to wash over my exhausted face. "Thank you, sweetie," I whispered, forcing fake tears into my eyes. "I am so terribly sorry for doubting you." Rachel squeezed my hand, her painted lips curling into a triumphant smile. "You do not have to thank us, Dad," she murmured softly. "We will take care of you forever." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet of the guest bedroom. "We will take care of you forever." Her final words hung in the stale air-conditioned breeze like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the closed door, my heart pounding a slow, agonizing rhythm against my bruised ribs. The sheer magnitude of her deception began to settle over me, chilling my skin beneath the thin cotton blanket. The afternoon sun slowly dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat frozen in my wheelchair, trapped in a house that had suddenly transformed into a maximum security prison. I tried to steady my breathing, but the adrenaline from my frantic escape from the basement was finally wearing off, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. Every bone in my body throbbed. My broken leg felt like it was encased in solid iron, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological torment spiraling inside my mind. I was a man who built things based on logic, structural integrity, and measurable facts. Now the foundation of my entire reality was completely crumbling beneath me. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the chair, waiting for the inevitable next move. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The digital clock on the mahogany nightstand glowed a harsh red, displaying 7 o'clock. Right on schedule, the door handle turned with a soft click. Rachel walked in carrying an ornate silver serving tray. The rich, savory aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the room, a smell that normally would have made my mouth water. She set the heavy tray down on the small rolling table beside my bed and carefully adjusted the napkin. "I made homemade chicken soup for you, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that same terrifyingly artificial sweetness. "I also brought you a tall glass of fresh orange juice. You need your vitamin C to help those bones knit back together." She pushed the rolling table directly over my lap, patting my shoulder affectionately. I looked down at the meal. Steam curled gently from the porcelain bowl, swirling above the golden broth. The tall crystal glass beside it was filled with brightly colored juice condensation, dripping slowly down the sides. It looked like the perfect loving meal, prepared by a devoted daughter. I forced my hands to remain steady as I reached for the heavy silver spoon. "Thank you, Rachel," I murmured, keeping my eyes locked on the bowl. "This looks absolutely wonderful." She smiled, stepping back toward the door. "Eat every last drop, Dad. You need your strength. Have a good night." She closed the door behind her, leaving me alone with the food. I stared at the tray for a long time. My stomach growled violently, reminding me that I had not eaten a single thing since breakfast. I picked up the spoon and dipped it into the warm broth, bringing a small amount to my lips. It tasted completely normal, savory, salty, and rich. I swallowed it smoothly, feeling the warmth spread down my throat. I took another spoonful, then a third. The soup was fine. I set the spoon down and reached for the crystal glass of orange juice. The cold condensation slipped against my rough, calloused fingers. I brought the rim of the glass to my mouth and took a slow, deliberate sip. Instantly, every alarm bell in my brain began to ring. As a structural engineer, my senses were honed by decades spent on industrial construction sites. I had spent my entire life working around volatile chemical solvents, heavy metallic compounds, and industrial sealants. I knew exactly what natural elements were supposed to smell and taste like. Beneath the overwhelming sweetness of the concentrated citrus, there was something else. It was faint, incredibly subtle, but undeniably present. It was a harsh, synthetic, metallic bitterness that coated the very back of my tongue. It tasted like a crushed alkaline battery mixed with industrial chalk. I froze, the cold glass hovering just inches from my face. My breathing hitched as a wave of pure, unfiltered horror washed over me. I slowly lowered the glass back onto the silver tray, my hands now trembling so violently that the orange liquid sloshed against the rim. The horrifying realization struck me with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. The heavy brain fog I had been struggling with every single morning, the terrifying memory lapses where I could not remember conversations from just hours before, the profound, debilitating exhaustion that kept me chained to this wheelchair, unable to even lift my own arms by mid-afternoon. The doctors at the hospital had told me the mild concussion would cause headaches, not complete cognitive failure. I had spent the entire week believing that my brain was naturally failing me, that the violent car crash had permanently damaged my mind. But it was all a manufactured lie. It was not a concussion. It was not old age. It was the haloperidol, the heavy-dose antipsychotic medication I had seen downstairs on the medical cart. My own daughter, the child I had cradled in my arms and protected from every harm in the world, was systematically crushing pills and dissolving them into my daily drinks. She was deliberately sedating me chemically, inducing an artificial state of dementia to destroy my mental capacity. The sheer cruelty of her plan paralyzed my heart. She wanted to erase my dignity, to reduce me to a drooling shell so she could easily take legal control over my life. She was manufacturing a medical crisis to justify locking me in that basement bed forever. Every sip of juice I consumed over the past 7 days was slowly poisoning my nervous system. I stared at the bright orange liquid, feeling a sickening surge of betrayal burn through my chest. I was completely trapped. I was completely alone. But I refused to be a victim in my own family's twisted game. The initial shock began to morph into a deep, burning anger. I looked at the tray. If Rachel came back and found the soup untouched and the juice full, she would know I suspected something. I had to play the part of the obedient, fading father perfectly. I wheeled my chair slowly toward the corner of the room where a large decorative potted ficus tree stood. It was a massive ceramic pot filled with dark, loose soil. I picked up the crystal glass with shaking hands, leaning over the edge of the pot. I poured the poisoned orange juice directly into the dirt, watching the thick liquid seep into the roots. I did the same with the chicken soup, burying the meat and vegetables deep beneath the topsoil so it would not smell. I left just a tiny amount of broth at the bottom of the bowl and a few drops of juice in the glass, making it look as though I had eagerly consumed every last bit. I pushed my wheelchair back to the center of the room, parked it by the bed, and waited for the night to fall. When Rachel finally came back to collect the tray, she smiled brilliantly, praising me for having such a healthy appetite. I nodded sluggishly, closing my eyes and letting my head loll to the side, pretending the heavy sedatives were already pulling me under. She turned off the main lights, leaving only the dim glow of the hallway, and gently pulled the door shut. The lock clicked. As soon as the sound echoed through the room, I opened my eyes. The darkness was absolute, but my mind was beginning to spark with a brilliant, terrifying clarity. For the first time in 7 agonizing days, my body was not processing a fresh dose of heavy antipsychotic medication. The hours crawled by in painful silence. Around 2 in the morning, the physical withdrawal began. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My hands trembled violently, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated through my skull as my brain fought to flush the residual chemicals from my bloodstream. I gripped the thick fabric of my bedsheets, grinding my teeth against the nausea. I would not call out for help. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. By the time the faint gray light of dawn began to creep through the window blinds, the heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded my thoughts for a week was finally gone. My mind was sharp. The sluggish confusion was replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a structural engineer. I lay there in the quiet room, staring at the ceiling, and began to analyze my situation the exact same way I would analyze a collapsing bridge. Every structural failure has a root cause. You just have to follow the cracks. If Rachel and Greg were willing to chemically lobotomize me to steal my retirement funds, what else were they capable of? The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My car crash, the accident that put me in this wheelchair and made me completely dependent on them. I replayed the terrible memory in my mind. I had been driving my truck, a vehicle I maintained with absolute perfection, down a steep, familiar hill in Atlanta. When I pressed my foot against the brake pedal, there was no resistance. The pedal slammed flat against the floorboard. The brake lines had completely failed, sending me crashing into a solid concrete barrier at 60 miles an hour. The police report had called it a catastrophic mechanical failure. I had believed them. But brake lines on a well-maintained truck do not just spontaneously fail. They have to be cut. They have to be tampered with. Greg owned a commercial real estate business that was constantly bleeding money. He had access to my garage. He knew exactly when I took my weekly drive down that steep canyon road. The crash was not an accident. It was a failed assassination attempt. When the crash did not kill me, they panicked. They needed a backup plan to get my money before I recovered and went back to my independent life. So they brought me into their home, locked me in a guest room, and started poisoning my food to legally declare me incompetent. The sheer magnitude of their evil was breathtaking. They wanted me dead, and when that did not work, they decided to bury me alive inside my own mind. I was a burden they wanted to erase completely from this earth, but they wanted to squeeze every last dollar out of my suffering first. Have you ever been betrayed by the person you protected your whole life? Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized you were staring at a stranger who wanted to destroy you? Let me know in the comments below. Because I promise you, the isolation of that moment is a darkness I would not wish on my worst enemy. But they made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They thought I was just a weak, broken old man who would quietly fade away into the shadows. They forgot who I really was. I spent 40 years calculating the breaking point of steel and concrete. I knew exactly how to dismantle a massive structure piece by piece until the whole thing came crashing down. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a wheelchair. I was an engineer, and it was time to systematically demolish the lives of the people who tried to bury me. Their entire plan relied on my silence. They believed I was trapped. They truly believed I was at their mercy. But they were wrong. I was awake. I was angry. And I was going to teach them a devastating lesson they would never forget. The hunt had officially begun. The morning sun filtered through the heavy bedroom blinds, casting thin, pale lines of light across my blankets. I had barely slept, spending the remaining long, dark hours of the night running through every possible scenario in my head. When the doorknob finally clicked at 9 o'clock, I immediately let my jaw go slack and allowed my eyes to glaze over. I slouched deeply into my pillows, the picture of a broken, sedated old man. Rachel walked into the room briskly, bringing with her the overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume. But she was not alone. Behind her stood a man who looked like he belonged in a maximum security prison yard rather than a luxury suburban home. Dad, Rachel chirped, her voice bouncing off the walls with that sickeningly fake enthusiasm. I have wonderful news. We finally found a private physical therapist who can do in-home visits. This is Todd. He is going to help you get your strength back. I slowly turned my head, blinking several times, as if it took monumental effort just to process her words. I looked at the man standing at the foot of my bed. My mind, now completely clear of the heavy antipsychotics, began to analyze him with the rapid, cold precision of a forensic investigator. Todd did not say a single word of greeting. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest, staring down at me with cold, dead eyes. He was wearing a set of pale blue medical scrubs, but they fit him terribly, stretching tightly across his bulging shoulders and thick neck. He looked like a bouncer in a stolen hospital uniform. As an engineer, I was trained to spot structural anomalies that indicate a larger hidden problem. Todd was a walking anomaly. Real medical professionals carry an air of clinical calm. They have clipboards, blood pressure cuffs, or at the very least, a gentle bedside manner. Todd carried absolutely nothing. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and I noticed his knuckles. They were heavily calloused, scarred, and flattened, the unmistakable hands of a man who spent his life punching things, not healing them. But the most glaring red flag was on the left side of his thick neck. He had attempted to conceal it with a heavy layer of flesh-colored makeup, but the sweat from the morning heat had caused the foundation to streak. Beneath the smeared makeup, I could clearly see the jagged dark blue ink of a prison gang tattoo poking out above his collar. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing shallow and erratic, playing the part of the confused patient. Rachel patted my foot through the blanket. "I have to go run to the bank, Dad," she said brightly. "Todd is going to do a preliminary assessment on your leg and help you with some stretches. You be good for him, okay?" She turned on her heel and practically skipped out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. The heavy click of the lock echoing in the quiet room sounded like a death sentence. I was now locked in a small room with a violent thug hired by my own family. Todd slowly walked over to the side of my bed. He did not wash his hands. He did not ask me how I was feeling or check my medical chart. He simply grabbed the edge of my heavy plaster cast with his rough, scarred hands. "Well, old man," Todd muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Let us see how much damage you really have." Without any warning whatsoever, he wrapped his massive fingers around my shattered shin and squeezed. He did not perform a therapeutic stretch. He did not test my range of motion. He dug his thick thumbs directly into the soft tissue just above my fracture line and applied a brutal, deliberate pressure. The pain was instantaneous and absolutely blinding. It felt exactly like hot iron driving straight through my skin into cracked bone. A sharp gasp escaped my lips, and my entire body went rigid. Sweat instantly beaded on my forehead as my nervous system screamed in agony. But I knew I could not fight back. If I showed him the strength and clarity I actually possessed, they would know the drugs were not working. They would accelerate their plan. So I forced myself to react exactly how a heavily sedated, helpless old man would. I let out a weak, pathetic whimper, letting my head roll to the side as if I lacked the motor control to push him away. Todd leaned in much closer, his face hovering just inches from mine. I could smell stale cigarette smoke and strong black coffee on his breath. He increased the pressure on my broken leg, watching my eyes closely. He was looking for a spark of defiance, a reason to escalate the violence. He was establishing complete and total dominance. This was not a medical evaluation. This was a silent, agonizing threat. He was showing me exactly what would happen if I caused any trouble for Rachel and Greg. My vision blurred from excruciating pain, but I kept my eyes completely dull and entirely unfocused. I let a tear slip down my cheek, playing the role of the broken victim to absolute perfection. After what felt like an eternity, Todd finally released his iron grip on my leg. He took a step back, wiping his hands on his scrub pants with a look of pure disgust. "Yeah, you are pretty far gone, aren't you?" he sneered, turning his back on me. "You are not going to be a problem at all." He walked over to the window, completely ignoring me as I lay there trembling. He had just confirmed my darkest fears. He was not a physical therapist. He was a ruthless enforcer, brought into my home to guarantee my total submission. Todd turned away from the window, the harsh morning light casting long, menacing shadows across his broad shoulders. He walked slowly back to the side of my bed, the heavy thud of his boots echoing like a ticking clock in the quiet room. He did not bother to adjust the pillows or offer a comforting word. Instead, he grabbed my right ankle, his scarred fingers digging into the sensitive skin just below the edge of the plaster cast. He lifted my leg a few inches off the mattress, sending a fresh wave of blinding pain shooting up my spine. But this time I was ready. I buried the urge to scream, letting my jaw hang loose and allowing my eyes to drift toward the ceiling, perfectly mimicking the vacant stare of a heavily sedated patient. "All right, Richard," Todd muttered, his voice dropping into a low, conversational tone that completely contradicted the brutal pressure he was applying to my fractured bones. "Rachel tells me you used to be a pretty smart guy. Built bridges or something, right? You probably made a lot of money doing that." I let out a weak, sputtering cough, turning my head slowly to look at him. "Bridges," I mumbled, my voice trembling and thick as if my tongue were swollen. "Yes. Steel, heavy steel, we built them strong." Todd chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that rattled in his throat. He twisted my ankle slightly, just enough to make me gasp. "Yeah, well, steel rusts, old man. Speaking of heavy things, your daughter mentioned you have a nice big safe back at your house in Atlanta. Said you keep all your important papers in there. She is trying to help you organize your life, but her memory is a little fuzzy." What was the combination to that safe again? My heart raced, but my expression remained entirely blank. The safe in my master bedroom in Atlanta contained my original will, the deeds to several properties, and the physical bearer bonds I had purchased decades ago. If they got into that safe, they could liquidate hundreds of thousands of dollars before the conservatorship was even finalized. I stared at Todd, letting a thin trail of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth. "Safe," I repeated slowly, blinking, as if trying to grasp the concept of the word. "The green safe." Todd leaned in closer, his stale breath washing over my face. "Yeah, the green safe. Give me the numbers, Richard." Make things easy on yourself. I closed my eyes, furrowing my brow in a manufactured display of intense confusion. 4, I whispered faintly. 4, then 18. And wait, no. It was 32. My wife chose it. She loved the number 32. Todd sighed heavily, pulling a small, battered notebook and a black pen from the pocket of his tight scrubs. He scribbled the numbers down, pressing the pen so hard the paper nearly tore. 4/18/32, he repeated, glaring down at me. Are you sure about that, old man? Because if you are lying to me, these stretching exercises are going to get a whole lot more painful tomorrow. I let out a soft, pathetic whine, shaking my head weakly. No, wait, I stammered, raising a trembling hand to my forehead. Maybe it was 42. Yes, 42. Mary always said 42 was a lucky number. We got married in 42. I let my voice trail off into a meaningless mumble, intentionally mixing up my late wife's name and the year we were married. I knew those numbers would not open the heavy steel door in Atlanta. The actual combination was based on my granddaughter Lily's birth date, a sequence I would take to my grave before handing it over to this thug. Todd shoved the notebook back into his pocket, his patience visibly wearing incredibly thin. He dropped my leg back onto the mattress with a heavy thud, ignoring my sharp intake of breath. Fine, he growled. We will test those out later. But Rachel also needs your online banking passwords, the main accounts, the ones with the big retirement funds. And she is looking for your power of attorney documents. Where did you hide the hard copies, Richard? I rolled my head back toward the window, pretending to be completely lost in a drug-induced hallucination. The bank, I whispered, letting my eyelids flutter shut. The bank is on Elm Street. Nice teller. Her name is Susan. She always gives me a lollipop. I smiled vacantly, sinking deeper into the mattress. Power of attorney. I do not have a lawyer. The bridge is falling down. We need more concrete. Todd slammed his massive hand flat against the bedside table, rattling the plastic water pitcher. Cut the crap, Richard, he hissed, leaning over me until his face filled my entire field of vision. The passwords. Give them to me right now. I stared back at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes, letting a look of pure, childlike terror wash over my face. I do not know. Cried out softly, my voice cracking perfectly. Please, my leg hurts. I want my wife. I want Mary. Todd stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his dark eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. He was looking for the sharp, calculating engineer beneath the frail exterior. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I was an empty shell, a broken man whose mind had been completely destroyed by the medication. Finally, a look of profound disgust settled over his rugged features. He stood up straight, brushing his hands off, as if touching me had somehow soiled him. He turned his back without another word, stalking across the cold bedroom with heavy, frustrated steps. The heavy oak door clicked shut firmly behind him, locking me completely inside the chilling silence. I dropped the helpless act immediately, taking a deep, ragged breath, and knowing my only window of opportunity was rapidly closing forever. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut and the deadbolt slid firmly into place, my entire demeanor shifted. The trembling in my hands stopped. The vacant, cloudy expression I had painted across my face vanished, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. I sat up straighter against the pillows, wincing, as the residual pain from Todd, twisting my broken leg, flared up through my nervous system. My shin throbbed with a fiery intensity, a brutal reminder of the physical threat I was now under. I took a deep, ragged breath, forcing oxygen into my lungs to steady my racing heart. The chilling silence of the guest bedroom pressed down on me like a physical weight. My window of opportunity was rapidly closing forever. Todd was not a patient man. If I did not give them the real combination to my safe or the location of my power of attorney documents, soon the physical violence would inevitably escalate. I could not fight a man of his size, especially not while confined to this wheelchair with a shattered leg. I needed outside intervention. I needed legal and physical protection before Tuesday arrived, and the conservatorship was finalized in front of a judge. I reached over to the mahogany nightstand, opening the top drawer as quietly as I possibly could. My smartphone was resting inside, right next to the thick hardcover book I had used as a prop yesterday. I pulled the phone out the cool metal casing, feeling like a lifeline in my calloused palm. I unlocked the screen and immediately tapped on my contacts, scrolling down until I found the name Bradley Pierce. Bradley had been my trusted estate lawyer and close personal friend for over 2 decades. We had played golf together. He knew my financial portfolio inside and out, and more importantly, he knew I was not suffering from any form of cognitive decline. If I could just get him on the phone, if I could just explain the psychiatric bed in the basement and the haloperidol they were sneaking into my food, he would send the police to this house within 10 minutes. I tapped the green call button and lifted the phone to my ear, my chest tight with desperate anticipation. I waited for the familiar ringing sound. I waited for the automated voice of his receptionist. But there was absolutely nothing. The line was completely dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared down at the brightly lit screen. In the top right corner, where there should have been 4 solid bars of cellular reception, there was only a small gray circle with a diagonal line through it. The words "No service" hovered ominously at the top of the display. A cold knot formed tightly in the pit of my stomach. This made absolutely no sense. Alpharetta was a highly developed, affluent suburb. The cell towers were everywhere. I had full reception the day Rachel drove me home from the hospital. I tapped the screen frantically, trying to force the phone to search for a network signal. I toggled the airplane mode on and off, praying it was just a temporary software glitch. The gray circle remained. I was completely disconnected from the cellular network. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down, relying on my engineering background to find a logical workaround. If the cellular network was down, I could still use an internet connection to send Bradley an emergency email or make a wireless call. I opened the settings menu on my phone and navigated to the wireless networks page. The household network, which Rachel had proudly named the Mansion Hub when I first arrived, was listed right there. But there was a small lock icon next to it, and my phone was refusing to connect. I tapped the network name, and a prompt appeared on the screen asking for the password. I carefully typed in the password Rachel had given me on my first day here, a simple combination of her anniversary date and Greg's name. I hit join. The screen loaded for an agonizing 5 seconds before a red text box popped up declaring the password was incorrect. I typed it again, slower this time, making absolutely sure my shaking fingers did not hit the wrong digital keys. Incorrect password. I tried the birthday of Lily. Incorrect. I tried her maiden name. Incorrect. They had changed the wireless password. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate, calculated move to sever my only lifeline to the outside world. I stared at the useless piece of glass and metal in my hands. The knot in my stomach tightened into a painful cramp. But something still bothered me. Changing the wireless password made sense if they wanted to stop me from sending an email. But how did they completely kill my cellular reception? You cannot simply turn off the cell towers in a major metropolitan suburb. My mind began to race, processing the physical environment of the room. If there is a localized dead zone in a place with otherwise perfect coverage, there has to be a source of active interference. There had to be a physical device blocking the radio frequencies. I threw the heavy cotton blankets off my body and gripped the rims of my wheelchair. I hauled myself out of the bed, the movement sending a sickening wave of pain up my fractured leg. I settled heavily into the chair and leaned over the side of the mattress, peering down into the dark, dusty space underneath the bed frame. At first I saw nothing but the wooden slats and a few stray dust bunnies. But then, tucked far back against the baseboard near the wall outlet, I saw a small, unnatural green light blinking rhythmically in the shadows. I had just discovered my very own private digital prison. I stared at the blinking green light, the realization washing over me like freezing water. It was a commercial signal jammer, the kind you plug into a wall outlet to block all cellular frequencies within a 50-foot radius. My instinct was to rip the device out of the socket and smash it against the hardwood floor. But I forced my hands to remain on the arms of my wheelchair. If I unplugged it, Greg would receive an alert on his phone. The sudden network restoration would tell them what I had done, and my cover as a helpless old man would be blown. I had to leave the jammer where it was. I pulled myself into a seated position, my broken leg throbbing with every single beat. I was isolated in a digital void, surrounded by people who wanted to destroy me. But as panic subsided, a stubborn resilience took root in my mind. I am an engineer. I have spent my life solving impossible problems under pressure. When a load-bearing pillar fails, you do not wait for the bridge to collapse. You find a secondary support system. You build a workaround. I scanned the guest bedroom, my eyes darting across the elegant furniture. I needed a secondary line of communication, something that did not rely on the local wireless network. I gripped the cold metal rims of my wheelchair and wheeled myself slowly toward the far corner of the room, where Rachel had dumped a pile of my belongings the day I was discharged. There were cardboard boxes filled with clothes, a stack of old books, and sitting at the very bottom, half hidden under a blanket, was my old leather tool bag. It was a heavy, battered thing made of thick cowhide, scarred by decades of exposure to harsh weather and construction sites. Seeing it sitting there in this sterile mansion felt like running into an old friend. I reached down, gritting my teeth as muscles in my lower back screamed in protest, and managed to hook my fingers under the brass buckle. I hauled the bag up onto my lap. The familiar smell of worn leather and metallic dust hit my nose, grounding me instantly. Rachel had packed this bag from my house, assuming it just contained old wrenches she could throw away later. She had absolutely no idea what this bag really represented. Back when I was managing major infrastructure projects, corporate espionage was a real threat. Rival contractors were always trying to get a look at our bids and sensitive blueprints. To protect my work, I had customized this bag myself. I ran my calloused fingers along the bottom interior of the bag, pushing aside a few rusty tools and a heavy tape measure. I pressed down firmly on the thick leather lining covering the base. With a satisfying click, the concealed magnetic latch released. I carefully lifted the false bottom, revealing a hidden compartment that was barely an inch deep. Resting silently in the dark space wrapped in a protective layer of foam was an older generation tablet computer. It was a rugged industrial-grade iPad I used specifically for remote job sites, places deep in the mountains, where standard cellular towers simply did not reach. Because my work required constant communication with government inspectors, this tablet was not equipped with a normal commercial SIM card. It was hardwired with a specialized prepaid data plan that operated on an alternative low-frequency industrial band. I pulled the tablet from its foam casing. It was cold to the touch and heavy in my hands. The screen was covered in a thick layer of dust, and a hairline crack spiderwebbed across the top left corner. I wiped the glass clean with my sleeve, my breath catching in my throat as I searched for the power button on the side. I pressed it down, holding it for 3 agonizing seconds. At first, nothing happened. The screen remained pitch black. I closed my eyes, a heavy weight settling over my chest. The battery was probably completely dead. It had been months since I last charged it. But then a faint white glow slowly began to illuminate the edges of the cracked screen. The familiar logo appeared in the center. I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders dropping, as absolute relief flooded my entire body. The tablet booted up slowly, the outdated operating system struggling to process the startup commands. I watched the screen with bated breath, ignoring the sharp aches in my leg and the exhaustion threatening to pull me under. The home screen finally loaded, displaying a cluttered grid of weather apps, structural drafting programs, and old email clients. But I did not care about any of that. My eyes shot immediately to the top right corner of the display. I needed to know if the industrial frequency was strong enough to bypass the cheap commercial jammer, plugged into the wall beneath my bed. For 5 agonizing seconds, the signal indicator remained completely empty. It read, searching, the letters blinking mockingly in the bright digital light. I gripped the edges of the tablet so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Come on," I whispered to the empty room. "Just give me one single bar." Suddenly the word "searching" vanished. In its place, a small, solid white triangle appeared. Then 3 bold bars lit up right next to it. 4G data. The specialized connection had easily bypassed the jamming field. I was connected to the outside world. I let my head fall back against the headboard, tears of pure relief stinging the corners of my eyes. Rachel and Greg thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had stripped me of my power, isolated me, and left me defenseless in their trap. But they had made a fatal error. They underestimated the preparedness of a man who spent his life anticipating disasters. Hope was fully restored. Now it was finally time to strike back. Holding the tablet, my first instinct was to type a frantic email to Bradley. I wanted a police cruiser immediately. But the rational part of my brain slammed the brakes on that idea. If I contacted him now, what would I say? I would claim my daughter is poisoning me and a thug is threatening my legs. Without hard evidence, a frantic message might play right into Rachel's hands. She would show the authorities her forged medical charts. She would smile and say I was suffering from hallucinations due to dementia. They might even expedite the conservatorship based on my erratic behavior. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to catch them speaking their true intentions out loud, where no lawyer could twist their words. I flipped the iPad over, running my thumb across the glass lens of the rear camera. Back on my job sites, I used this to document structural flaws and record contractor meetings. The microphone was sensitive, designed to pick up voices over the roar of heavy machinery. It was exactly what I needed to turn this guest bedroom from a prison into a trap. I lowered the tablet and began scanning the room for the perfect vantage point. The nightstand was too close to the bed, and Greg would notice any new object sitting there. The oak dresser was positioned too low, capturing only waist-level footage. My eyes landed on the tall, built-in bookshelf situated in the far corner of the room. It was packed with leather-bound volumes of classic literature. Rachel bought them for decoration, meaning neither she nor Greg would ever read them. The third shelf offered an unobstructed view of the room, including the center floor, where Todd conducted interrogations, and the bed where I slept. It was the perfect spot. But reaching it meant I had to lift myself out of this wheelchair. I gripped the rubber tires and pushed across the rug, the friction fighting me every inch. I parked directly in front of the towering bookshelf and locked the wheels. I took a deep breath, preparing my body for the physical toll this would take. I planted my good left foot firmly onto the hardwood floor and grabbed the wooden edge of the shelf. With a sharp groan I desperately tried to muffle, I forced myself upward. The agony that shot through my shattered right leg was blinding. It felt as though a jagged knife was twisting directly into the marrow of my bone. Sweat erupted across my forehead, stinging my eyes, but I refused to let go. I locked my arms, holding my frame steady as I balanced on one foot. My right hand trembled violently as I pulled 2 massive encyclopedias apart, creating a narrow gap about an inch wide. I grabbed the tablet and wedged it into the dark crevice. Placing it there was not enough. I had to think like an engineer. If the tablet was perfectly vertical, the camera would simply record the opposite wall near the ceiling. I needed a downward angle. I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out a folded piece of cardboard I saved from a tissue box. I wedged the cardboard beneath the top edge of the tablet, tilting the device forward at a precise 20-degree angle. I checked the alignment, making sure the tiny camera lens was positioned perfectly between the spines of the heavy books, completely invisible from the room. Next, I had to address the battery. The device held a 50% charge which would not last the night if it was continuously recording high-definition video. I carefully lowered myself back into the wheelchair, my breathing ragged and heavy. I wheeled back over to my battered tool bag, digging my hands deep into the main compartment until my fingers brushed against a rectangular block. It was an industrial power bank fully charged and capable of running the tablet for at least 48 hours. I grabbed a charging cable, wheeled back to the shelf, and endured the excruciating pain of standing up a second time. I plugged the cable into the tablet, routing the wire carefully behind the books so it was hidden from view, and tucked the power bank out of sight. Everything was physically in place. I reached into the narrow gap, my thick fingers lightly pressing against the glass screen. I opened the camera application, verified the wide-angle view captured the entire room, and switched it over to the video mode. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs as I pressed the red circular button. A counter appeared at the top of the screen, the numbers quietly ticking upward. 001. 002. The trap was officially active. I adjusted the screen brightness down to the absolute lowest setting, ensuring no unnatural glow would reflect off the surrounding books in the dark. I pushed the heavy encyclopedias closer together until only a microscopic sliver of the lens was exposed to the room. I carefully wiped my fingerprints off the polished wood of the shelf using my shirt sleeve, leaving absolutely no trace of my interference. I lowered myself back down into the wheelchair, for the final time, my muscles screaming in absolute exhaustion. My shirt was soaked with cold sweat, and the throbbing in my fractured leg was so intense it made my vision blur at the edges. But as I rolled my chair back to the center of the room, positioning myself near the edge of the bed, a deep sense of control washed over me. I was no longer a blind victim waiting for the slaughter. I was the architect of their downfall. I let my head drop back against the cushions, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to slow into a weak, rhythmic pattern. The camera was rolling. Now I just needed my captors to return and give me the rope they would ultimately use to hang themselves. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I sat perfectly still in the wheelchair, my eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. I had set the trap, but a trap is entirely useless without bait. To catch predators like Rachel and Greg, the bait had to look completely helpless and thoroughly broken. I had to convince them that their poisonous chemical cocktail had finally eroded the last foundations of my mind. I needed them to believe the Richard Dalton they knew, the strong engineer who built bridges and provided for his family, was completely gone. I needed to give a performance so pathetic it would strip away whatever caution they had left. I wheeled my chair closer to the mahogany nightstand. Resting beside the digital clock was a tall plastic pitcher filled with ice water. I reached out, my calloused fingers wrapping tightly around the condensation-slicked handle. I stared at the clear liquid, a sickening knot forming in my stomach. What I was about to do went against every instinct of pride I had cultivated over 71 years. I was a man who prided himself on his dignity. I had always stood tall even in the face of brutal labor and immense personal loss. To deliberately humiliate myself to reduce my existence to that of a soiled burden felt like tearing off a piece of my own soul. I closed my eyes, fighting a wave of burning shame. But then I remembered the heavy leather restraints bolted to the steel bed in the basement. I remembered the red marker charting my artificial cognitive decline. Dignity would not save my life. Survival required profound sacrifice. I lifted the heavy pitcher. My hands shook not from weakness, but from pure resolve. I tilted the plastic spout toward my lap and let the freezing water pour directly onto my thighs. The ice-cold liquid soaked instantly through the thin fabric of my gray sweatpants, chilling my skin and pooling uncomfortably beneath me on the padded seat. I let out a sharp gasp at the sudden cold, letting the water drip down the chair and splatter onto the polished hardwood floor. I carefully set the nearly empty pitcher back onto the nightstand, making sure it looked exactly as if my trembling hands had dropped it in utter confusion. I slumped heavily back against the cushions, letting my shoulders cave inward and allowing my chin to rest weakly against my chest. I did not have to wait very long. The muffled sound of Rachel speaking to Greg echoed from the hallway, followed by the sharp clicking of her designer heels approaching my door. The brass handle turned with a loud click, and the heavy door swung open. Rachel stepped into the room, a stack of freshly sorted mail in her hands. The moment her eyes landed on me, I sprang the trap. I let out a loud, pathetic, trembling wail. It was a sound I had not made since the devastating night my wife passed away. "Mary." I cried out, my voice cracking and echoing off the walls with raw, manufactured desperation. "Where is Mary? I want my wife! Please, where did she go?" Rachel stopped dead in her tracks. The fake, cheerful smile she usually wore for me vanished in an instant. She did not rush to my side. She did not drop the mail to comfort her grieving father. Instead, she took a slow step backward, her eyes darting from my tear-streaked face down to the puddle of water, spreading slowly across the hardwood floor. I watched her expression shift through the hidden lens of my own tearful eyes. There was no sympathy. There was no pity. There was only a profound, naked disgust. Her upper lip curled into a sneer, and she instinctively pinched the bridge of her nose as if the sight of me offended her senses. I continued to sob, letting a thick strand of saliva slip from the corner of my mouth, my hands grasping weakly at the empty air. "Mary," I whimpered, rocking violently back and forth. "Tell her to come home. It is getting dark." Rachel turned her head toward the open doorway. "Greg," she called out, her voice flat, cold, and devoid of human emotion. "Get in here right now." Heavy footsteps rushed down the hallway, and Greg appeared in the doorframe. His brow furrowed in annoyance. He looked at Rachel, then followed her disgusted gaze down to my soaked pants and the dripping wheelchair. He let out a harsh, mocking breath, crossing his arms. I kept crying, raising my trembling hands to shield my face, pretending I was terrified of his presence. "Who are you?" I wailed, shrinking back into the seat. "Where is my house? I need to go to work. The bridge needs more steel. I need Mary." Greg looked at his wife, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across his handsome face. He nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Well," he murmured, his voice laced with cruel satisfaction. "Look at the great Richard Dalton now. You really need to get the cleaning staff in here, Rachel. It smells exactly like a hospital ward." Rachel did not move to help me. She stood perfectly still in the center of the room, staring down at the man who had sacrificed his entire life to give her the world. She tilted her head slowly, a terrifyingly empty look in her eyes. "It is fine," she replied, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room, captured perfectly by the hidden microphone on the bookshelf behind me. "Just leave him there for a while. The dosage is working. His brain is mush." Those words hit me like a physical blow. The ultimate confession was spoken freely. The deep humiliation burned my chest, but I swallowed the bitter betrayal, locking my intense anger safely behind a mask of total defeat. They took the bait perfectly. The hours dragged on, until the heavy silence of midnight settled over the sprawling house. I lay perfectly still in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the central air conditioning and waiting for the steady rhythm of footsteps upstairs to finally cease. Once I was absolutely certain that Rachel and Greg had retired to their master suite for the night, I threw off the damp cotton blankets. The cold air bit into my skin, but I ignored the discomfort. I gripped the arms of the wheelchair and pushed myself up, ignoring the burning agony shooting through my shattered right leg. I balanced carefully on my good foot, reaching my trembling hands into the narrow gap between the heavy encyclopedias on the bookshelf. My fingers brushed against the smooth glass of the tablet. I pulled it out, bringing it down to my lap, before sinking heavily back into the chair. My breathing was ragged, but my mind was laser-focused. I unplugged the charging cable and opened the camera application, stopping the recording. I tapped the small square thumbnail in the corner of the screen to open the video gallery. I plugged a small wireless earpiece I had kept in my tool bag into my ear, ensuring not a single sound would leak into the quiet bedroom. I pressed play. The screen illuminated my face with a faint, ghostly glow. The first few hours of the recording were nothing but the empty room, occasionally interrupted by Rachel briefly checking in on me while I pretended to sleep. I dragged my finger across the playback bar, fast-forwarding through the mundane footage. But then the timestamp reached exactly 8 in the evening. The heavy oak door swung open on the screen. Greg walked into the room, his tie loosened and his posture rigid with stress. He paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, running his hands through his hair. A moment later, Todd stepped into the frame. The massive man did not look like a physical therapist anymore. He wore a dark leather jacket and carried an air of absolute terrifying menace. Greg immediately stopped pacing and turned to face him, his body language defensive but undeniably submissive. I turned up the volume on the tablet, pressing the earpiece deeper into my ear. I needed to hear every single syllable of their conversation. "What the hell are you doing here at this hour?" Greg hissed, his voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "I told you never to come to the house unless Rachel is expecting a medical visit." Todd chuckled, a dark, grating sound that made my blood run cold. He took a step closer to Greg, invading his personal space. "You do not give the orders anymore," Todd rumbled. "The boss is losing his patience. You said the old man would be legally declared incompetent by the end of the month. We have given you enough extensions." "My commercial real estate firm is completely bankrupt," Greg fired back, his voice cracking with desperation. "I cannot magically make the money appear. The market tanked and the development deal fell through. I owe your syndicate $3 million. Do you really think I would be going through the trouble of sedating my own father-in-law and faking a conservatorship if I had another way out? I just need a few more days until the judge signs the final papers. Once I have total control over his retirement accounts and the estate, I will wire the entire $3 million to the boss, plus the interest. You have my word." Todd reached out and grabbed Greg by the collar of his expensive dress shirt, lifting him slightly off the floor. "Your word means absolutely nothing to us," Todd sneered. "The boss sent me here to ensure the old man breaks. I am the insurance policy. If you do not have that $3 million transferred into our offshore accounts by next Friday, we are not just going to take your massive house. We are going to take your life. And we will probably take your pretty wife and that little daughter of yours too. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Greg swallowed hard, his face pale with absolute terror. He nodded rapidly, his trembling hands raised in sudden surrender. "Yes," he choked out, "crystal clear." Todd released him, giving his chest a hard shove backward. "Good," Todd muttered, adjusting his dark leather jacket. "Keep feeding the old man the haloperidol pills every day. Make sure his brain is fried by the time you drag him into court next Tuesday. I will be back tomorrow for another physical therapy session." Todd turned abruptly and walked out, leaving Greg leaning heavily against the wall, gasping for air. I paused the video, the image of my terrified son-in-law frozen on the screen. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the dark bedroom as the magnitude of the truth crashed down. Greg was not just a greedy man looking for an early inheritance from his father-in-law. He was a desperate animal trapped in a dark corner by a violent criminal syndicate. He owed a ruthless loan shark exactly $3 million. Todd was not just a random thug hired to quietly intimidate me. He was a highly trained cartel enforcer planted inside my home to guarantee the syndicate got their money. My entire life savings were the absolutely only thing standing between Greg and a shallow, unmarked grave. The stakes had just suddenly escalated far beyond simple family betrayal. This was undeniably a matter of life and death, and my precious little granddaughter Lily was caught right in the deadly crossfire. They were completely willing to permanently sacrifice my mind, my money, and my life just to save their own skin. I pulled the wireless earpiece slowly out of my ear, my hands shaking with terrifying clarity. I knew I absolutely had to completely destroy them all before next Friday arrived. To do that, a recorded conversation would simply not be enough. A clever defense attorney could easily argue that Greg was under immense duress and exaggerating his financial situation to appease a violent intruder. I needed concrete, undeniable documentary evidence. I needed bank statements, the forged psychiatric evaluations, and the paper trail connecting Greg to my ruined truck. All of those critical documents had to be stored on Greg's primary computer inside his locked home office at the far end of the main corridor. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted to 1 in the morning. The house was a sprawling tomb of silence. I looked at my wheelchair sitting near the bed. I could not risk using it. The heavy rubber tires squeaked faintly against the polished hardwood, and navigating the thick Persian rugs in the hallway required too much exertion, which would inevitably create noise. If I was going to reach that office undetected, I had to stay incredibly low. I had to crawl. I slipped the tablet back into its hidden compartment inside the leather tool bag and secured the false bottom. I took a slow, deep breath, mentally preparing myself for the sheer physical agony I was about to endure. I shifted my weight forward and carefully slid off the edge of the mattress. I braced my fall with my calloused hands, lowering my battered body onto the cold, unforgiving floorboards. As my shattered right leg dragged across the edge of the bed frame, a blinding flash of pain ripped through my shin. It felt as though a serrated blade was violently sawing through my bone marrow. I bit down hard on my lower lip, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood as I choked back a scream. I lay flat on my stomach for a long moment, my forehead resting against the dusty wood, waiting for the dark spots to clear from my vision. I opened my eyes and looked down the long, dark stretch of the hallway. The moonlight spilled through the tall, decorative windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. I began to move. I reached forward with both hands, planting my palms flat against the wood, and pulled my upper body forward. I kept my left knee bent, using it to push my weight, while my right leg, encased in the heavy plaster cast, dragged uselessly behind me like a sack of wet cement. The physical effort required for a single foot of progress was absolutely staggering. I am 71 years old, and my body had just survived a catastrophic collision. My bruised ribs screamed in fierce protest with every single contraction of my chest muscles. Sweat poured from my forehead, stinging my eyes and soaking the collar of my flannel shirt. But I kept pulling, 1 inch at a time. I was a man who had spent his life navigating dangerous high-altitude construction sites. I knew how to focus my mind entirely on the immediate task, blocking out the overwhelming scale of the danger. I dragged myself out of the guest bedroom and into the vast, open corridor. The temperature dropped significantly out here, the marble tiles of the foyer radiating a deep, biting chill that seeped right through my clothes. I had to plan my route with absolute mathematical precision. I knew from my first day in this house that the floorboards near the central heating vents had a tendency to warp and creak under applied pressure. I deliberately steered my body toward the heavy baseboards along the left wall, where the structural joists provided the most rigid support. Halfway down the hall, disaster nearly struck. As I pulled my heavy cast over the edge of a thick, woven rug, the plaster scraped against a decorative brass floor grate. The sharp, metallic scraping sound echoed loudly in the cavernous space. I froze instantly, pressing my face flat against the cold rug, my heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. I stopped breathing entirely. Above me, the floorboards of the second story groaned. Heavy footsteps shifted in the master bedroom directly overhead. Greg was awake. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to God that he was just rolling over in his sleep. The seconds stretched into absolute eternity. I listened to the house settle around me, every tiny creak magnifying in my ears. Finally, the footsteps stopped. A bedspring whined, and then silence reclaimed the massive house. He had not come out to investigate. I let out a slow, trembling breath, a fresh wave of cold sweat washing over my back. I could not afford another mistake like that. I resumed my agonizing crawl, moving even slower now, testing every single inch of the floor with my hands before committing my body weight. The pain in my right leg transitioned from a sharp, stabbing sensation into a deep, relentless, burning ache that radiated all the way up into my hip. My arms trembled violently with muscle fatigue. My calloused fingers were rubbed raw against the coarse fibers of the rugs and the hard edges of the marble tiles. It felt exactly like I was dragging myself across a vast desert of broken glass. But the memory of Lily's terrified face and the horrific psychiatric bed waiting in the basement fueled an intense fire in my gut that absolutely refused to let me quit. After what felt like hours of agonizing labor, the dark shape of the mahogany door finally loomed in the shadows ahead of me. It was Greg's home office. I dragged myself the final few feet, my breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. I reached the doorframe and collapsed against the baseboard, my chest heaving violently. I had made it, but the hardest part was just beginning. I reached up with a shaking, exhausted arm and grabbed the smooth brass doorknob. I applied a slow, steady pressure, turning it gently to the right. It did not yield. The mechanism was locked tight. I rested my sweaty forehead against the cool mahogany wood, closing my eyes in a momentary wave of pure defeat. A locked door. It was such a simple, mundane obstacle, but to a crippled man dragging himself across the floor, it felt like an impenetrable fortress wall. But then a faint metallic clinking sound echoed softly from the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. Before I had left my bedroom, right after I had secured the tablet inside the false bottom of my leather bag, I had instinctively reached into the side pouch. My fingers had brushed against a small flat steel tension wrench and a standard hook pick. I had carried them for years, a habit formed from constantly losing the keys to padlocked equipment sheds on chaotic construction sites. I reached into my pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the two thin pieces of cold steel. I shifted my weight, propping myself up on my left elbow so I could reach the brass keyhole. My hands were shaking so violently from the physical exertion that I dropped the tension wrench twice, the tiny clatter sounding like gunshots in the silent hallway. I took a deep, ragged breath, forcing my heart rate to slow. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying a microscopic amount of rotational pressure. Then I eased the hook pick into the top. It was a standard 5-pin tumbler lock meant to keep out a curious child, not a determined engineer. I felt the pins carefully lifting them one by one until I felt the satisfying tiny click of the shear line aligning. The cylinder turned smoothly. The lock disengaged with a soft pop. I grasped the handle, turned it, and pushed the heavy door open. The office was pitch black, smelling faintly of expensive leather and stale scotch. I crawled over the threshold, pulling my dead right leg behind me, and reached up to quietly push the door shut until it latched. I dragged myself across the plush carpet toward the massive oak desk sitting in the center of the room. Reaching the desk was only half the battle. I had to pull my entire body weight up the side of it to reach the computer. I grabbed the edge of the polished wood, my bruised ribs screaming in absolute agony as I hauled myself up into the heavy leather office chair. I slumped back into the seat, gasping silently for air. Once the pain subsided into a manageable throb, I leaned forward and pressed the power button on the sleek desktop tower hidden beneath the desk. The monitors flared to life, bathing the dark room in a stark, blinding white light. I squinted, raising a hand to shield my eyes until they adjusted. A login screen appeared, displaying Greg's name and a blank password field. I rested my fingers on the keyboard. I needed to act quickly. I had no idea how long I had before Greg might wake up for a glass of water and notice my empty bed. I typed in the word password. Incorrect. I tried his anniversary date. Incorrect. I tried his own birthday. Incorrect. A small bead of cold sweat rolled down the side of my face. If I locked the system by guessing incorrectly too many times, my entire plan would be completely ruined. I stared at the blinking cursor, trying to understand the mind of a desperate, arrogant man. What number would he use? Then a vivid memory flashed in my mind. The day Lily was born. Greg had been so incredibly proud, holding that tiny bundle wrapped in a pink hospital blanket. Before the greed consumed him, he had loved her. I slowly typed in the numbers of her birth date. Month, day, year. I held my breath and pressed the enter key. The screen froze for a fraction of a second, and then the desktop loaded. I was in. My eyes darted across the digital landscape of his computer. The desktop was cluttered with hundreds of files, spreadsheets, and folders. I grabbed the wireless mouse, my calloused hand trembling, and clicked on the primary document directory. I bypassed the folders labeled with his failing real estate properties and looked for anything unusual. At the bottom of the list, a folder caught my attention. It was simply titled Personal Expenses. I double-clicked it. Inside were various digital receipts for luxury car leases and expensive country club dinners. But one file, a scanned image document, had a strange cryptic title. It read, Auto Consult Cash. I hovered the cursor over it. A sickening feeling began to twist tightly in my gut. I clicked the file. The image expanded to fill the large monitor. It was a scanned copy of a handwritten invoice from a small independent auto body shop located in a notoriously rough industrial district of Atlanta. I scanned the lines of text. The customer name was intentionally left blank, but the vehicle identification number written at the top matched my truck perfectly. I read the itemized list of services. It did not say anything about routine maintenance. It specifically listed custom fluid line modification, but it was the handwritten note scribbled hastily in blue ink at the bottom of the page that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. It read, brake line severed at main cylinder. Guaranteed failure on incline. Payment received in full. $5,000 cash. I stared at those words, my breathing completely stopping. $5,000. That was the exact price Greg had placed on my life. He had actually found a black market mechanic, paid him with a stack of $100 bills, and explicitly ordered him to turn my truck into a deadly weapon. This was not a tragic accident. This was a calculated, cold-blooded assassination. The man sleeping peacefully upstairs had ruthlessly plotted to end my life for a quick cash payout. I was now completely alone. I stared at the scanned invoice, the glowing white screen illuminating the cold sweat dripping down my face. My own son-in-law had paid a stranger to murder me. The reality of it was so heavy, so completely monstrous, that for a long moment my brain simply refused to process it. I had to force myself to breathe, pulling air into my lungs in shallow, trembling gasps. I could not afford to fall apart right now. The brake line receipt was the motive, the smoking gun that proved their utter depravity, but it was not the entire plan. I needed to see the rest of it. I needed to know exactly how they planned to steal my money if the accident did not kill me. I carefully minimized the image file, my hand shaking so badly I could barely control the wireless mouse. I returned to the main directory of the computer. My eyes scanned the long list of folders again, looking for anything else related to my finances or my medical care. Near the very top of the desktop, completely hidden in plain sight, was a newly created folder. It was labeled simply E-Transition, my initials, Richard Dalton. Transition. I double-clicked the folder. The screen populated with dozens of highly organized PDF documents. I opened the very first one on the long digital list. It was a forged official medical evaluation on the letterhead of a prominent Atlanta psychiatric clinic. I read the name of the examining doctor at the top. It was the exact same doctor whose name was printed on the bottle of haloperidol downstairs. I scrolled down to the clinical notes. According to this completely fabricated document, I had been suffering from severe, rapidly progressing Alzheimer's disease for over a year. The lies were meticulously constructed. The report detailed aggressive outbursts, severe memory loss, and a complete inability to manage basic personal hygiene. It claimed that I wandered the house at night confused and dangerous. It even cited the car crash as an incident caused directly by my supposed cognitive failure, completely erasing the severed brake lines from the narrative. I read the clinical summary at the bottom of the page. The patient, Richard Dalton, represents a profound danger to himself and requires immediate round-the-clock, secure psychiatric confinement. I felt completely and physically sick. They had built an entire alternate reality on paper. They had purchased a corrupt doctor to completely rewrite my medical history, painting me as a violent, mindless shell of a human being. I closed the medical evaluation and opened the next document in the folder. This one was far worse. It bore the official seal of the county probate court. It was a formal petition for a total conservatorship, also known as legal guardianship. I read through the dense legal jargon, my heart sinking lower with every single paragraph. Rachel was petitioning the court to strip me of all my legal rights. She was asking to be appointed the sole guardian of my physical person and my estate. If the judge signed this piece of paper, I would legally cease to exist as an independent adult. I would have fewer rights than a child. I would not be able to vote, sign a contract, or even decide what medical treatment I received. Rachel would have absolute unchecked power over my life. I scrolled down to the scheduling section of the document. The hearing was already on the official court docket. It was scheduled for next Tuesday at 9 in the morning. Today was Thursday. I had less than 5 days before a judge slammed a gavel down and handed my entire life over to the very people trying to murder me. 5 days until I was legally erased from the world. I opened the final subfolder, desperately needing to see the scope of their financial strategy. It contained an exhaustive spreadsheet detailing my entire estate. Every penny I had saved over 40 years of grueling construction work was perfectly itemized. My liquid cash, my investment portfolios, the massive equity in my house, and my pension funds. The grand total sat at the bottom of the page in bold black numbers. $4.5 million. But next to those numbers was a column labeled Liquidation Timeline. They had already drafted the transfer requests to sell off my blue-chip stocks and empty my high-yield savings accounts the very second the conservatorship was granted. They planned to completely drain the estate within 48 hours of the court ruling. $3 million was earmarked for an anonymous offshore corporate account, which I knew was the violent loan shark syndicate. The rest was allocated to pay off Greg's failing commercial real estate debts and fund their lavish lifestyle. They were going to feed my life savings directly into the hands of organized crime. Every single drop of sweat I had poured into those massive steel bridges was being used to wipe out their pathetic mistakes. I sat there in the dark office, surrounded by the glow of the monitors, the sheer scale of their betrayal crushing down on me. I had spent 4 decades building a secure legacy for my family. I had sacrificed my own comfort working through agonizing pain and freezing weather so my daughter would never have to worry about her future. And this was my reward. A fake medical chart, a stolen fortune, and a legal death sentence orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. They were not just taking my money. They were stealing my history, my dignity, and my freedom. The intense anger that had been slowly simmering in my chest suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It became a cold, pure, unshakable resolve. They thought I was just a broken old man waiting to die. They were wrong. I was going to stop them no matter the cost. I would completely dismantle their intricate plans and absolutely destroy their lives. I forced my trembling hand to keep moving the wireless mouse across the smooth surface of the wooden desk. I thought I had seen the very worst of their depravity, but the dark pit of their cruelty had no bottom. I closed the spreadsheet detailing the systematic theft of my life savings and opened the final folder on the desktop. It was simply titled Relocation. I double-clicked the icon, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my bruised ribs. A single portable document file was saved inside, labeled with the name of a prominent international airline. I opened the file and stared at the glowing white screen. It was an electronic itinerary for 2 first-class one-way tickets departing from Atlanta International Airport next Wednesday night, exactly 1 day after the conservatorship hearing. The destination, printed in bold black letters, was Belize City. They were fleeing the country. Belize is a nation well known for its highly secretive offshore banking laws and its lack of extradition treaties for certain financial crimes. They were going to liquidate my entire estate, wire the money to the syndicate, take the remaining millions for themselves, and completely vanish into a tropical paradise. I stared at the passenger names listed on the boarding passes. Greg and Rachel. Just 2 names. I scrolled down, my eyes frantically scanning the digital page for a third ticket. I looked for a child's fare, an adjoining seat reservation, anything. But the page was entirely blank. There was no ticket for Lily. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I opened a web browser and navigated to his email account, which was still logged in. I typed Lily into the search bar, desperate to find some alternative arrangement. A boarding school receipt, a long-term nanny contract, anything to prove they were not monsters. An email thread popped up from just 2 days ago. It was an automated correspondence from the State Department of Child and Family Services. Rachel had submitted an anonymous inquiry about the legal process of relinquishing parental rights and surrendering a minor to the state foster care system. She had cited overwhelming financial hardship and the burden of caring for a severely disabled, violent parent. Me. They were going to use my fabricated dementia as an excuse to abandon their own 7-year-old daughter to the cold, unforgiving bureaucracy of the state. They considered their own flesh and blood to be nothing more than excess baggage, a minor inconvenience standing between them and my stolen fortune. The sweet little girl who had bravely warned me about the basement room was going to be thrown away like garbage while her parents sipped cocktails on a beach. A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak desk so tightly my knuckles ached. But the horrors of that computer were still not finished. At the bottom of the email inbox, marked with a bright red flag for high importance, was a payment confirmation receipt from a medical holding company. I clicked the link and a digital invoice appeared on the screen. It was a non-refundable deposit for a permanent residential placement at a facility called the Pine Ridge Behavioral Center. I recognized the name instantly. Years ago, I had worked as a structural consultant reviewing public buildings for the county. Pine Ridge was a notoriously underfunded, decrepit state-run psychiatric asylum located deep in the rural swamplands of southern Georgia. It was a dumping ground for the forgotten, a place plagued by constant state investigations for severe patient abuse, extreme neglect, and horrific living conditions. The medical bed downstairs in the basement, the leather restraints, the haloperidol pills. Those were never meant to be my permanent punishment. They were just the temporary tools they needed to make me compliant for the court hearing. Pine Ridge was my actual destination. Once Rachel secured the legal guardianship on Tuesday morning, she was going to sign the authorization forms, drug me into a complete stupor, and have me transported to that hellhole in the middle of the night. I would be locked inside a concrete cell, stripped of my name, my dignity, and my sanity, left to rot in absolute misery until my broken body finally gave out. They were condemning me to a living nightmare while they walked away multi-millionaires. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the harsh white light of the monitors reflecting off my tear-streaked face. For 71 years, I had defined my life by my role as a protector. I had poured every ounce of my love, my energy, and my soul into raising Rachel. I had forgiven her selfish mistakes, paid her debts, and always believed that deep down she carried the same moral compass I had tried to instill in her. But staring at those plane tickets and that asylum receipt, a profound and permanent shift occurred within my chest. The deep, unconditional fatherly love I held for my daughter shattered into dust. The woman sleeping upstairs was not my child. She was a hollow, soulless parasite. Whatever bond of blood we shared evaporated into the cold air of that office. My daughter was officially dead to me. Only my enemies remained. I quickly inserted a small digital storage drive I had found in my tool bag into the computer port. I copied the forged medical files, the brake line receipt, the plane tickets, the foster care emails, and the asylum deposit. I safely ejected the drive, possessing all the hard evidence I needed to completely destroy them. I powered down the computer, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. I lowered my bruised and battered body painfully back down to the cold hardwood floor. The agonizing journey down the long hallway awaited me once again. But I no longer felt the physical pain in my shattered leg. I only felt the freezing mechanical anticipation of delivering absolute justice. The return journey down that long, freezing corridor was entirely fueled by pure adrenaline and cold, calculated rage. My right leg still dragged behind me, encased in heavy plaster, but the physical pain had faded. My mind was sharp, whirring with the precision of a massive engine running at maximum capacity. I carefully navigated the warped floorboards with stealth, slipping through the shadows like a ghost in my own family's house. I finally reached the door of the guest bedroom, pushed it open, and dragged myself over the threshold. I closed the door quietly until the latch clicked shut, securing myself back inside the digital prison they had built for me. I hauled my exhausted, trembling body back up into the wheelchair, my breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. I did not bother to rest. There was absolutely no time to waste. Tuesday was approaching fast, and I needed to strike a devastating blow before the sun came up. I reached down into the battered leather tool bag and retrieved the hidden tablet, waking the screen to reveal the solid connection of the industrial cellular network. I plugged the small digital storage drive into the adapter port of the tablet. I opened my encrypted email client and immediately composed a message to Bradley Pierce. Bradley was not just a lawyer, he was a ruthless litigator who despised white-collar criminals. I typed his personal direct email address into the recipient bar. The subject line was simple but urgent. Emergency legal intervention required. Life or death. I attached every single file I had copied from Greg's computer. The forged psychiatric evaluations, the petition for the total conservatorship, the non-refundable deposit for the Pine Ridge Behavioral Asylum, the one-way first-class tickets to Belize, and finally, the handwritten receipt from the black market mechanic confirming the assassination attempt on my life. I kept the body of the email incredibly brief, knowing the documents would speak entirely for themselves. Bradley, I am being held against my will and chemically sedated by Rachel and Greg. They are attempting to steal my estate and flee the country. Do not call this house under any circumstances. Prepare the counter-evidence for the hearing on Tuesday morning. I will see you in court. I pressed send, watching the progress bar fill as the massive attachments flew through the encrypted network, safely landing in Bradley's inbox. But Bradley could only handle the legal defense. I needed heavy, undeniable offensive power to dismantle the violent loan shark syndicate threatening my home. I opened a secure browser window and navigated directly to the online portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically targeting the Financial Crimes and Organized Crime Division in Atlanta. I filled out an anonymous, high-priority tip form. I detailed the exact name of Greg's bankrupt firm, the $3 million debt he owed, and the physical description of the enforcer named Todd. I uploaded the audio recording I had captured earlier that night, the one where Todd explicitly threatened our lives and admitted to the extortion plot. I hit submit, knowing the federal agents would immediately begin tracing the digital footprints of the syndicate. With the authorities fully alerted, I turned my attention to the final and most crucial step of my plan. I had to completely neutralize the core motivation behind their entire horrific scheme: the money. I logged into the secure portal of my primary financial institution. I stared at the dashboard, which proudly displayed the cumulative result of my life's work. $4.5 million spread across various high-yield accounts and liquid portfolios. Rachel and Greg believed that securing the conservatorship on Tuesday would instantly give them the keys. I was about to change the locks permanently. I navigated to the estate planning section of the portal and initiated the immediate creation of an irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard will or a revocable trust, an irrevocable trust cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the beneficiary. Once the money is transferred into it, the grantor legally surrenders all ownership rights to those assets forever. I typed Lily's full legal name into the beneficiary field. I set the conditions of the trust to ensure she could not access the principal amount until she turned 25 years old, guaranteeing that Rachel and Greg could never touch a single penny of it, even as her parents. I selected all of my checking accounts, my savings accounts, my stock portfolios, and the deed to my property in Atlanta. I moved every single asset into the transfer queue. The system prompted me for a secondary authentication to confirm the massive transfer of wealth. I typed in my master password and pressed the digital signature pad. My calloused finger dragged across the glass screen, leaving a glowing trail of digital ink. I hit confirm. The screen loaded for 3 tense seconds before a bright green checkmark appeared, followed by a bold confirmation message. The transfer was completely successful. I refreshed the main dashboard. My total net worth, which had just been $4.5 million a minute ago, now read $0.00. Overnight, sitting in the dark guest bedroom, I had made myself bankrupt on paper. I had absolutely nothing left to my name. If Rachel somehow managed to win the conservatorship on Tuesday, she would be appointed the legal guardian of a completely penniless old man. I smiled, a dark, cold satisfaction washing over me. I unplugged the tablet, shut it down, and hid it safely back inside the false bottom of my tool bag. I pulled myself out of the wheelchair and crawled into bed, pulling the damp covers up to my chin. The physical pain in my leg was still there, but my soul felt lighter than it had in a week. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the jaws were ready to snap shut. The next 4 days passed in a haze of calculated deception. I continued to play the role of the broken, mindless old man, perfectly drooling at the dinner table, staring blankly at the walls, and allowing Todd to violently handle my shattered leg without showing a single spark of resistance. Rachel and Greg grew increasingly confident. By the time Tuesday morning finally arrived, they did not even bother to speak to me as a human being. They treated me like a broken piece of furniture that needed to be moved. They dressed me in a faded, wrinkled flannel shirt and a pair of stained sweatpants, deliberately making me look neglected and pathetic. Greg practically shoved me into my wheelchair, his hands rough and impatient. They loaded me into the back of a specially rented accessible van, not uttering a single word to me, during the 30-minute drive into the heart of downtown Atlanta. The Fulton County Courthouse was a massive, imposing structure of polished granite and towering glass windows. As Greg wheeled me through the heavy security doors and into the bustling lobby, my heart began to pound, a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, echoing with the hurried footsteps of lawyers and anxious defendants. We rode the crowded elevator up to the 4th floor in absolute silence. Rachel stood directly in front of me, nervously adjusting the lapels of her conservative, expensive navy blue designer suit. She had pulled her hair back into a tight bun, wearing minimal makeup to ensure she looked the part of an exhausted, devoted daughter, carrying the heavy weight of the world on her delicate shoulders. We moved down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor and entered courtroom 4B. It was a sterile, intimidating room paneled in dark walnut lined with rows of uncomfortable wooden benches. Greg parked my wheelchair awkwardly at the respondent table, leaving me facing the towering wooden bench where the judge would soon preside. I slouched forward, letting my chin rest on my chest, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. I kept my eyes unfocused, but from beneath my lowered brow I scanned the room with the precision of a hawk. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for a bored-looking court reporter and a weary bailiff standing near the side door. There was no sign of Bradley Pierce yet. I had specifically instructed him to wait outside until the absolute perfect moment. I needed Rachel to commit fully to her perjury on the official court record before we sprang the trap. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden door behind the bench opened and Judge Eleanor Hastings walked into the room. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for processing probate cases with ruthless efficiency. The bailiff instructed us to rise. Greg stood up straight, smoothing his expensive tie, while Rachel placed a gentle, perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder, sighing softly to draw the judge's attention to my supposed inability to stand. Judge Hastings sat down, adjusting her reading glasses, and opened the thick manila folder containing the forged documents Rachel had filed. The judge looked over the rim of her glasses, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, before settling heavily on Rachel. We are here today to review the petition for permanent conservatorship over the person and estate of Richard Dalton, the judge announced, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. The petitioner is the respondent's daughter, Rachel Montgomery. You may proceed. Rachel stood up slowly. She walked over to the wooden podium in the center of the room, gripping the edges tightly, as if she needed the physical support just to remain standing. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the performance of a lifetime officially began. Your Honor, Rachel started, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. I am here today because my father, the man who raised me and loved me, is simply no longer there. Over the past year, we have watched his mind slowly slip away into the dark shadows of severe dementia. It started with forgotten conversations, but it has escalated into something truly dangerous. Last month, in a state of deep cognitive confusion, he caused a horrific car accident that nearly took his life and shattered his leg. Since we brought him into our home to care for him, his condition has deteriorated completely. He does not know where he is. He cries out for my mother who passed away 10 years ago. He cannot feed himself, bathe himself, or understand basic financial concepts. Rachel paused, letting a single brilliant tear escape her eye and roll down her cheek. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a tissue to dab delicately at her face. It completely breaks my heart to stand here today. Your Honor, she whispered, her voice cracking beautifully. I love my father more than anything else in this entire world, but he is a profound danger to himself. He is vulnerable. He needs constant specialized psychiatric care that we can no longer provide at home. I am asking the court to grant me full legal guardianship over his medical decisions and his financial estate so I can protect the assets he worked so hard to build and ensure he is placed in a secure facility where he can be safe for the rest of his days. I sat there in my wheelchair, quietly listening to every single poisonous word falling directly from her lying mouth. She was wrapping my execution in the warm, comforting blanket of a daughter's love. She wanted the judge to hand over my $4.5 million, effectively paying her to lock me in a rural asylum. Judge Hastings nodded sympathetically, turning the pages of the forged medical evaluation. Is there any legal counsel present today representing Mr. Dalton? She asked the quiet room, peering over her glasses. Yes, Your Honor. A booming voice echoed from the back of the room. I am here to represent Mr. Richard Dalton. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung completely open, striking the wooden stops with a resounding, violent crack. Bradley Pierce, my trusted attorney of 20 years, strode confidently down the center aisle. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two towering men wearing dark suits, their federal badges clearly visible on their leather belts. The entire courtroom froze. Rachel gasped loudly, her fake, carefully practiced tears drying up instantly as she gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Greg spun around in his chair, the blood draining completely from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. I did not wait for Bradley to reach the front of the room. I gripped the thick armrests of my wheelchair and firmly planted my good left foot onto the polished marble floor. With a sharp, determined inhale, I pushed my body upward. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight, ignoring the dull throb in my casted leg. I reached up and quickly unbuttoned the oversized, stained flannel shirt they had forced me to wear, letting it drop to the floor, to reveal the sharp, custom-tailored dress shirt and expensive silk tie I had secretly put on underneath that morning. I was no longer the pathetic, drooling victim they had wheeled into this room just minutes ago. I looked exactly like the powerful, commanding structural engineer who had built empires from steel and concrete. Bradley reached my side and handed me a pair of sleek, black forearm crutches. I gripped the ergonomic handles, feeling the familiar, undeniable strength return to my broad shoulders. Judge Hastings watched this miraculous transformation with wide, thoroughly stunned eyes. "Counselor," she demanded, her voice cutting through the heavy, stunned silence of the room. "What is the meaning of this interruption? And who exactly are these men standing in my courtroom?" Bradley stepped directly up to the high wooden bench, placing a massive, incredibly thick stack of legal folders directly in front of the judge. "Your Honor," he stated clearly, his voice ringing with absolute, unwavering authority, "we are here to submit a formal motion to dismiss this highly fraudulent petition immediately. Furthermore, we are presenting undeniable concrete evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy. The men standing behind me are special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They are here to execute multiple high-level arrest warrants based on the evidence contained within those files. My client Richard Dalton is not suffering from any form of cognitive dementia. He has been systematically and intentionally poisoned with heavy antipsychotic medications by his own daughter and son-in-law in a cold, calculated attempt to steal his entire life savings." Rachel let out a high-pitched, breathless sound, stumbling backward from the podium as if she had been physically struck. "That is an absolute lie," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. "He is completely crazy. He does not know what he is saying. The sickness has ruined his brain." I turned to face her, leaning heavily on my strong metal crutches. My expression was colder than the winter steel I used to build my bridges. "The sick game is finally over, Rachel," I said, my voice steady, deep, and completely lucid. "I know all about the psychiatric bed hidden down in the basement. I know about the haloperidol pills you maliciously crushed into my evening soup. I know about your evil plans to dump me in the Pine Ridge Asylum. And I know about the first-class plane tickets to Belize." Greg leaped up from the respondent table, his eyes darting frantically toward the side exit door. But the two federal agents instantly moved to block the aisle, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Judge Hastings quickly opened the folders Bradley had provided. She rapidly scanned the real certified medical evaluation conducted by my personal physician just hours prior, confirming I was in perfect cognitive health. She reviewed the hidden camera footage captured on my tablet, the scanned receipt from the black market mechanic who deliberately cut my brake lines, and the horrifying emails detailing Rachel's inquiry to abandon her own daughter to the foster care system. The judge's face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson red. "There is one more matter, Your Honor," Bradley continued, turning his head to look directly at Greg. "The petitioners claim they desperately need legal control of Mr. Dalton's estate to manage his $4.5 million financial portfolio. But even if this court had tragically granted the conservatorship today, they would have found absolutely nothing to manage. Last Thursday night, my client legally transferred his entire net worth into an irrevocable, untouchable financial trust. The sole protected beneficiary of that trust is his granddaughter, Lily. Mr. Dalton is officially penniless on paper. The massive fortune they tried to steal simply does not exist anymore." The sheer, absolute devastation that washed over Greg's face was a masterpiece of total despair. His knees literally buckled beneath his weight, and he collapsed heavily back into his wooden chair. He realized in that exact second that he had failed completely. The violent loan shark syndicate would be coming for him, and he had absolutely no money to save his own life. Rachel fell to her knees, right there in the middle of the aisle, burying her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. But these were not crocodile tears anymore. This was the terrifying, agonizing reality of a selfish woman watching her entire life crumble into dust. Judge Hastings slammed her heavy wooden gavel down, the loud sound echoing like a cannon shot. "This petition is completely and permanently denied," the judge barked, her eyes blazing with righteous, uncontrollable anger. "Federal agents, you may proceed with your duties." The two federal officers stepped forward without a single word of hesitation. They grabbed Greg by his expensive suit jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet. The cold, sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent courtroom. Another agent pulled Rachel up from the floor, firmly securing her shaking hands behind her back. She thrashed wildly against the officer, screaming loudly for me to help her, begging for my forgiveness, crying out that she was still my little girl. I looked her dead in the eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but profound pity for the hollow, greedy monster she had chosen to become. "You stopped being my daughter the exact moment you put a violent price tag on my life," I whispered coldly. They were dragged out of the courtroom in utter disgrace, facing decades in federal prison for attempted murder, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. The massive wooden doors swung shut behind them, finally ending the darkest chapter of my entire existence. The horrific nightmare was officially over. Later that afternoon, with the full, unwavering backing of the court and Child Protective Services, I was granted immediate emergency custody of Lily. I walked out of that imposing granite courthouse, with my brave little granddaughter holding tightly to my hand. We did not go back to the cold, soulless mansion in Alpharetta. We drove straight back to my safe, quiet, familiar house in Atlanta. The house I had built with love, hard work, and unshakable values. Sitting on my porch that evening, watching Lily play safely in the warm sunlight of the garden, I finally found my peace. The money was safe, waiting for her when she was old enough to truly understand its immense value. But I had learned a painful lesson that no amount of wealth could ever teach. Money can build a house, but it can never buy a conscience. Sometimes the family you choose or the one you save is the only family that matters.